What's up, y'all? It's Shuffle, and today we are going to talk about Torchless in Darkest Dungeon, and we're going to discuss why it is actually not hard. Before we get started, make sure that you check out the box below for all the social media stuff like Discord, Twitch, and Patreon, and then like, comment, subscribe, all that awesome stuff that every single YouTuber probably tells you to do, and now it is hardwired into your brain. For those of you unaware, Torchless Darkest Dungeon is a self-imposed challenge. It is one where you choose to not take torches with you into dungeons, and then you snuff your light down to 0 on the first possible chance, and this gives every single battle increased damage, crit, stress, and also more loot. It makes everything more threatening, and you might be thinking, okay, that is naturally harder. And there are other caveats to it as well, like increased surprise rates and the chance that Shambler spawns as a regular hallway battle. If I can be quite honest as well, the only reason this is even remotely difficult as a mode is specifically because of Shambler. Once you get to Veteran, you have to be watching out for Shambler, and then once you get to Champion, it gets pretty difficult because Champion Shambler scales up pretty hard in terms of difficulty, which means every team that you take into that dungeon has to have him in mind, but also the appearance rate gets up to 12%, I believe, which is pretty freaking high. Shambler itself is for a later time, we're going to talk about it later. So for the other stuff in Torchless, as I was saying, the reason it's actually not difficult is because after a certain point, you're just playing regular Darkest Dungeon, it feels like. I know that once I got past week about 10 or so, and I had a couple good trinkets, it stopped feeling like the mode that it was supposed to be. And I think it's just because it's so poorly designed, and it reinforces a lot of what would be Darkest Dungeon's metagame if it had one. To further explain this context, when I was doing my attempts to beat Torchless before I finally did it, the first weeks were the most difficult because I had no access to the guild. Reynold starts with horrible moves, Dismiss is okay, and then you're kind of at the mercy of whatever the stagecoach gives you for the first couple weeks, and your heroes are level 0, which means once they enter the dungeon, they are taking bonus stress just from entering, because every dungeon is level 1, and if you don't know, you take penalties for being lower level than the dungeon itself. So I probably had a few dozen restarts in the first few weeks, and you can go, okay, there's the challenge Shuffle. I'm still going to disagree, and again, I'll explain in a minute. But once I got past week 10, I only got past it 3 times, and after the 3rd time is when I beat the game. Getting past it the 2nd time is actually when I would have beaten it, but I threw the save file pretty much for content. So once I got back to that point and I got past it again, I had a couple decent trinkets, I had a couple good heroes. It was just the same game after that. It just reinforced the Darkest Dungeon meta that I was discussing a second ago, where instead of you thinking you have to change everything you're doing, you really don't. It just depends on what you've normally been playing in Darkest Dungeon, like your regular team comps that you bring out. For Torchless, it has all of these different challenges like increased damage, increased stress damage, increased crit, increased surprise. 3 of those 4 things are countered by the same game plan that wins at like all times, which is having faster characters, so speed becomes more beneficial, and stuns. The reason stuns and speed become like the most important thing is because the scaling on the damage and the stress gets so out of control that Jester has trouble keeping up with it, Vessel has trouble keeping up with it, Occultist has to roll really high consistently on heals to keep up with it, which means instead of getting hit for 35 with a stress attack or a Gunner Bandit cleaving you with a stress attack, the gunshot, and you take 40, 25, 25, 25 across your entire team in terms of stress, instead of dealing with that garbage, instead you just stun them and you prevent all of that damage. So that's why Torchless doesn't so much change, I shouldn't say change, but it doesn't define challenge in Darkest Dungeon. What it does is it forces you more into a very optimized strategy, which is already very powerful in just regular play. The other part of the 4 things I listed, so like I said, increased damages, increased crit, and then the increased surprise chance. Surprise is offset by scouting. Scouting is very powerful, and no joke, once you get your scouting up to about 45, 50, that's only a couple trinkets, maybe a scouting quirk. Once you get the Ancestors map, it's pretty much GG, or if you have like a couple Seer Stones, for instance. Like once you get your scouting past 40, the surprise thing is no longer as much of an issue because you're consistently scouting a hallway or 2, so you only get surprised every now and then, If you don't know, again, the mechanic, if you scout a fight on the map, you will not be surprised by it. You can surprise the monsters, but you will not be surprised yourself. So what that means is if you're stacking speed, you have a couple stuns on your team, and you have like 50 scouting, you're going to get through most dungeons pretty safely besides Shambler. The other thing that does not change to offset the quote meta for Darkest Dungeon is that all the monsters have increased damage and stuff like that, but they don't have increased resistances. They don't get plus 20% all resist or something like that, which means these stuns are just even more powerful than they were before. The monsters also sadly don't get more fun things to interact with, like they don't get Torchless specific attacks. I think that would have been a nice addition. Would have been pretty hard to implement all that, I will admit, from a game design standpoint, but it would have been pretty fun to have something like that. You may be thinking to yourself as well that because there's more stress and more damage, that means that the facilities outside of battle become more important, and honestly they don't. Like, you still need to use them to stress heal, especially in the early weeks, but honestly, once I got to Veteran, I wasn't using that much in terms of stress healing, just because I had so much access to extra scouting and speed and stuns, that my heroes, like, yeah, they would come out with maybe 60 stress sometimes, or 40, but it was pretty manageable to keep them out of affliction range, and that's where the facilities get a lot better. So what this means is that the higher the player power gets in the playthrough, the penalty of having to spend more money, which is already offset by the Torchless treasure drop rate, which gives you more chances for loot, so more gold, more heirlooms, stuff like that. So having the increased treasure already offsets the penalty for having to use the facilities more often, and then once you get to a point where you're not having to use the facilities as often as you were, you can just stack money. Like, I actually was able to get the bank, get over 100,000 gold by the end of the game, even though I was spending it constantly. Like, I had people in my Twitch chat saying, I can't believe that you're down to, 10,000 gold, 15,000. It's like, because, I'm spending the money, but I'm also making it back very quickly. I spoke earlier in this video about how the meta became prevalent in Torchless, so having fast stunners became really good. So characters like Plague Doctor were on a lot of my teams, Occultist was on a lot of my teams, and Abomination actually did pretty well, even though I didn't have Broken Key, so shoutouts to A-Bomb. Although you can't transform in Torchless, like the stress gain is just too much, where transforming is usually not worth, so having Stunbot A-Bomb is fine. One of the criticisms I hear when people talk about Torchless, like I've gotten this in a couple of the videos I posted where I show snippets of my Torchless run, and people say, oh, you have Arbalest and Leper, against Shambler, like, why are you running these types of characters that you can't run them in Torchless? And that's simply not true at all. As I was saying before, if you get your scouting high enough, you can run these characters. Suddenly, Leper doesn't have to worry about getting thrown into rank 4 at the start of every fight, which makes him a lot easier to bring along, and Leper really pays for his spot in the team with the massive damage he's putting out. And surprisingly, with Leper, Arbalest, those two specifically, I would argue those are my two highest performing characters over the entire playthrough. So when I start uploading the file in, I don't know, a couple weeks or something like that, you're gonna see what it was looking like. The Arbalest did really well. The Leper, I think I had one Leper, but he was just incredible the entire way through. And the other character that really surprised me was Hellion. Like, I know Hellion's already pretty good, but Hell's Hairpin is such a strong trinket that being able to get it early and have a couple Hellions on your team is really nice. My point, though, is I want to reject this myth that you can't bring certain characters to Torchless because they may get surprised and thrown to the back. There are characters like, as I was saying, with Leper and Arbalest, they may get screwed by getting surprised, but they are so durable as units, especially Leper with Solemnity, that it's one of the few things that can stand up to the constant punishing of damage or punishment of damage that comes out from the enemies in Torchless. Arbalest also has the benefits of things like pretty good healing camp skills and Marching Plan. Marching Plan is another massive speed boost to your entire team, which again helps you prevent enemies from doing damage to you. If you've not seen my Action Economy video, you should probably do so, because in that one I specifically talk about how prevention is the best form of healing, because preventing more damage is usually better than reacting to it in this game. Shambler is the only thing that really throws a wrench into the regular DD playstyle with Torchless, and that's just because the spawn rate of Shambler is frankly too high, and it was actually balanced around a previous thing that they patched out. So Thick found this out and he told me about it, and he showed me some video evidence where Before, I don't know exactly how long ago this was. This might have been before Color of Madness, because I think that was like a massive patch to everything. So Shambler can spawn in hallways in Torchless. It can replace a room battle. The chance of getting Shambler is 1% on Apprentice, 4% on Veteran, and 8% on Veteran, sorry, and then 12% on Champion. Before, with these spawn rates, you were able to retreat from Shambler and despawn it, which is fine. I think that's actually okay. Some people may argue that it's not, and I completely understand that line of thinking, but the appearance rates of Shambler were balanced around the fact that you could retreat and despawn it. Like, you weren't meant to fight it every time, so it would be like you walk into a room, or not a room, a hallway, and Shambler pops up. It gets 1 or 2 attacks off, because I can't remember if you can retreat on the first round. I don't think you can in some cases. I digress. So Shambler might hit you once or twice before you're able to get out of there. And then once you retreat back to the room that you went into, since you're playing in Torchless, your whole team is going to get like 40 stress minimum. So they're probably close to afflicting at that point. You might have to camp afterwards, which is another good reason to save your camping. But they changed it so instead of being able to retreat from Shambler and despawn it, you just can't do that. So if you retreat from Shambler and come back to the fight, Shambler is still there. But they did not change the appearance rates of Shambler. Instead, it still has the same 1, 8, and 12% chance of appearing, which means that the appearance rate of Shambler is still balanced around an old mechanic, or I should say feature, that you were able to run from it and despawn it. And they took that away. So instead, now Shambler is always there, but it kept the same spawn rates, which means Red Hook probably just missed this. It's a big game. I can understand that they missed that little caveat, but it should instead have Shambler spawning at something like 1%, 4%, and 8% for Champion at the top end. I would also accept something like 5% across the board, so just 1 in 20. I think that would be okay too, because Shambler at the start of the game is a bit easier, actually a lot easier than Shambler at the end of the game. So I'd rather just kind of keep it as a consistent thing where I always have to consider it. I do like the idea of Shambler spawning in Torchless, just because Shambler, like I said, it's the one thing that really changes how you approach Torchless, because once you want to do champion missions in Darkness, you have to consider Shambler when you build your team. So you always have to build a team that can fight Shambler, and if you don't and it shows up, you are in big trouble in most cases. Shambler itself does not actually get tougher in Torchless, because when you fight the dang thing, normally it is already in 0 light. So Shambler as a fight does not change at all. It's just the fact that it can pop up at any time. What this really comes down to is that Torchless impacts 2 areas of the game the hardest. It impacts the first 10 weeks of the game, because you get surprised all the time and you can't pick your own moves because you don't have the guild, and Reynold has like the most abysmal starting loadout possible. I didn't realize how bad it was until I started doing Torchless. And the other part that gets impacted is the champion dungeons, because Shambler's spawn rate is just too freaking high. If you own DLC for the game that gives you extra regions, those aren't impacted by Torchless at all. Crimson Court is always considered to be high torch. It has its own special lighting called Bloodlight. And if you go to Farmstead, that has its own special light as well, which depends on whatever the heck the torch rolls. You get these different effects. So the Torchless stuff only applies to regular dungeons in the base regions and a few of the endgame dungeons. So we're about to head into some spoiler territory. The endgame missions didn't feel that dangerous considering the Torchless benefits. It still felt pretty close to what they normally were. There were just a couple extra crits, it felt like, but for the most part, the stress was manageable, because in the first couple endgame missions, there are ample opportunities to stall heavily. So even with a kind of garbage team, I still got through the first one without losing anyone. I don't even think I had a death door check. I think I had 1 or 2 afflictions. I healed one of them off. The second mission, I was chilling pretty freaking easily for like the majority of it. The only time I was even close to being remotely in danger was the same thing that can kill anyone at any time in Darkest Dungeon, and that's just like a random crit with a follow-up of a very strong move afterwards. So I had a Man-at-Arms. He got crit for like 35, and then right after, he got hit for 17, and he was on Death's Door because I think he had Crimson Curse. So outside of that one instance of a crit and a follow-up hit, I was pretty safe for the majority of the dungeon. Considering how short the third mission is for the end game, it got a little closer than I was hoping for, but we still pulled it out, and obviously I'm going to stop there in terms of the spoiler content, even though we're still being kind of vague. And I really expected more from the Torchless experience. I was expecting it to make me a better player, and it did in some ways, but it really didn't in a lot of ways. It was just more, I had to focus on having extra speeds and stuns, even though I usually play that way anyway, so control styles are usually just winners. And honestly, outside of the first few weeks and the last few weeks of the playthrough, the game felt like nothing had really changed. When I got hit, sometimes it was a bit harder than I was expecting, but for the most part, everything just felt fine. The stat changes hyper-inflate stress specifically, and it makes really not fun interactions like gunner bandits cleaving you for an absolute boatload of stress, or drummer pigs cleaving you for a boatload of stress. And you can say, sure, that's the challenge, because you have to make sure that you're preventing the damage and all that, but like I said, it really just reinforces the Darkest Dungeon meta of having heavy turn denial game plans or hyper aggression where you can just wipe stuff out in like 2 turns. The core reason that I'm making this video is because I've seen too many people on the social medias, and I've had people like express this to me personally when I've talked about the game, and they say things like, oh, you haven't beaten it on this, so therefore you can't talk about it. I had one person accuse me that I had not beaten the game even on Blood Moon when I was talking about it, and I thought that was pretty hilarious, and I showed them some video proof, and they like doubled down on it still, but whatever. And the thing with Torchless is, it's not hard, it's just poorly balanced, and I think that people conflate or misunderstand what difficulty is when they think they're dying. So it's very easy to die in the early weeks of Torchless because you just get people afflicted, and you have to take people at like 60 stress out on missions until you have enough people from the stagecoach to make it easier to deal with. And so people are getting hit for a bunch of stress, they're getting hit for more damage, the crits are, off the charts in a lot of cases, and people think, oh, this is challenge, and it's really not, it's just bad design. Which means my goal is I want to inject this idea into discussion for Darkest Dungeon where we're not basing what people have accomplished or whatever, or saying like your opinion is invalid because you haven't done this. When you bring up Torchless and Blood Moon and stuff as reasons for why someone doesn't know what they're talking about, you're just doing a disservice to everyone at that point. So Torchless, it's not difficult, like I said, it's poorly balanced. And honestly, I think if you can beat the game on Blood Moon or Stygian, if you want bragging rights, I think you can get them there. Just because in Darkest and Radiant, you can eventually win just by grinding out the game. You will eventually get enough trinkets and enough good heroes built up to conquer what you're doing. So Blood Moon and Stygian have actual game over modes, which is why they're more challenging. But even Blood Moon isn't that much harder than Darkest, so I really don't want to see more talk where people are saying, yeah, I beat it on Torchless, which means you don't know what you're talking about. Try beating it on Torchless Blood Moon before you step up to me, nerd. It just needs to stop. So take it from someone that has beaten it, that it's not anything major. It's pretty much the same game after a certain point. It has too much imbalance in terms of the stress and Shambler spawn rates, and outside of that stuff, it's honestly, like I said, it's the same game. This is even going into a bigger topic that I'm going to make a video on later, but just, you can always crank up the difficulty on yourself. There are always more self-imposed challenges that you can do. So people can sit here and go, oh, you haven't beaten the game on Blood Moon, you're bad. And then you can go, well, you haven't beaten on Torchless Blood Moon, so you're bad. Yeah, well, you didn't beat on Torchless Blood Moon Deathless all bosses, you're bad. Yeah, you didn't beat on Torchless Blood Moon Deathless all bosses with no stress healing, you're bad, right? You can always just crank the dial further, and at some point it needs to stop. Torchless itself does not teach you how to be a better player in most cases. Like, it doesn't teach you things that any experienced DD player doesn't already know. Most of us know that stuns are good, speed is good, accuracy is good. You have all those things, you can do pretty well in the game. And if you have all those in Torchless, it's going to feel a lot easier than if you don't. So that's why other challenges, like when Spartan beat the game with no gold, that was pretty crazy. Or you can beat the game with no stuns, like Thick did, which is absolutely just nuts and crazy. I would never do that. Those kinds of things will make you a better player than just playing with Torchless. Like, being able to beat the game, even on Darkest with, for instance, no gold, that's a bigger accomplishment than beating Torchless, I would argue. Alright, y'all, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for watching. Next up, I'm going to start working on the Leper Guide at some point. I'm behind on that. Go figure. Shuffle's behind on something. I stream on Twitch 4 days a week. Come watch that stuff. Join Discord if you have not. And if you like what you're seeing / hearing, consider supporting on Patreon. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.